the communication team is not saying no live stream in Zoom, but they also do live stream in Facebook. So this is yeah. This is the where the audience also coming from. Oh yeah, now it is running. Okay, we're live and we have this sign. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Global Minds for Ukraine, hosted by CUBE School of Economics. My name is Evgeny Monastyrsky. I'm a first-year graduate student in History and European Studies at Yale University. I'm a friend of CUBE School of Economics, and I'm here to continue hosting something launched by Professor Timothy Brick and in capacity of friend CUBE School of Economics. I will be moderating today the presentation and lecture, whatever you call it, by Professor Anna Laura Stoller. I'm apologizing upfront for maybe some interruptions from my side because I'm on train between New York and New Haven, as I was at the United Nations this morning. But this is again supporting the already a good tradition of Ukrainian scholars doing as much as they could for Ukraine from all parts of the world. We had instances when Timothy was speaking from bomb shelter, and we have instances when any scholar speaking at this wonderful initiative was involved in this war indirectly, but we all was living through this, and so I'm apologizing if there will be some interruptions from my side, but I will be taking Q&A and I will be responsible for that, and I will be blamed for that if something goes wrong. So Anna and Laura Stoller is a Willy Brandt Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology and Historical Studies in the New School of Social Research in New York, which is a separate pleasure for me as a former fellow at the New School, as a historian who enjoys reading her work for maybe half of my career of being a historian since I started to read this. Yeah, she's a famous historian anthropologist for her books, Capitalism and Confrontation, if I remember this correctly, and the Race and Education of Education of Desire. This is also something in my curriculum before, and now not for some years already. And Laura Stoller was working on this internal frontiers concept. And I remember reading those articles a couple of years ago, and soon it will be a book coming out at the Oxford University Press. And with no longer ado, I just want to thank Professor Stoller that she's with us today, and she will speak on the matter of book we will be able to read only like in 6 weeks or so. And thank you for joining us in this troublesome times. And screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So during this 6th week of Russia's assault, I want to dedicate this talk to my Kiev colleagues with total support for an audacious bravery in the face of Russia's imperial invasion, atrocities, relentless murder, and destruction in the UK. I stand among the many who join in the demand for immediate and more material aid to Ukrainians and for actions that cut Russia off from the rest of the world. So thank you for having me. I'm honored. I'm humbled, truly, and moved, and find it sort of breathtaking to imagine what it takes to refuse not to live, to carry on one's critical thought and make room for it at such a time. I offer this essay, which, everything feels kind of inadequate, right? Both because it's about what I call imperial democracies and concept work fused with and measured by a critical politics. It's the opening essay in a book coming out next month of the same title, Interior Frontiers, Essays in the Entrails of Inequality. So let me just provide a really brief context for the talk. It may be that this talk is too long. I spent all day trying to shorten it and got a third of it cut. Some of it you probably heard before, but for me, it remains this really important, this sort of center for really 3 decades of my thinking. So the book is really just a set of essays that attempt to navigate the shadows and what I call the shatter zones of democratic polities, that considers how imperial features are folded through a liberal and liberal orders, not separate entities of metropole and colony, as I did argue 25 years ago in Tensions of Empire, but where racial inequities thicken in the borderlands of interior frontiers. Sometimes those frontiers or those spaces that define the contours of belonging and not belonging are porous, often fixed and firm. Entry requirements can be opaque, neither verbal nor visible. Illegibilities are secured in code. I don't know how many of those who are attending this are really fluent in English. If I speak too fast, which I always speak too fast, no matter where I am, please just slow me down. I won't be in any way offended. The sights and sensibilities through which inequities work are disparate. Borrowing Ralph Ellison's phrase, I look to unexpected sights and scenes that register what he called the lower frequencies of difference and denigration. Seemingly benign sights are laid bare as toxic, as in one essay that eviscerates the warped criteria assigned to taste and who can have it, which is an engagement both with Kant and Bourdieu. Another essay addressing the seared lives that longing, envy, and humiliation inscribe. I try to hew close to the less noted violences that describe, distribute, and assess humankind's. Interior frontier is a concept that's accompanied me, as I just said, for more than 30 years in tracing the fault lines that racial states produce and the distinctions on which they depend. Etienne Balibar, I'm going to call him EB. He's a dear friend for some 30, 25 years, and it's just hard for me to call him Balibar. It's just much too distant. So EB, as I call him, sent me his 1990 essay of that title in 1990, just as my work was turning to the racial distinctions that colonialisms install. Having just made my way to the French colonial archives, I saw racial imaginaries occupying every page of these documents, sometimes in sotto voce, sometimes with a fervent white sovereignty making up colonial common sense. I was stunned by the essay titled La Frontière Intérieure, by the affinity his work was taking in mind. Neither Fichte, on whose term it was in 1808, nor EB's rethinking of the term in 1990 were concerned with imperial formations in any way, nor race. But the term captured what I had already been writing, the ambiguous work that boundaries and enclosures, frontiers do when they occupy interior spaces of polity and person, porously encased. Invisible bonds were another key term in Fichte's formulation, 1809, 1808, from national regeneration, is how he was thinking, for national regeneration. And in colonial documents in the French and Dutch colonial archives, invocation of the same exact term, invisible, and they used to say it, they'd say it, bien invisible. And who could not share in them marked a core dispositif of colonialism's racial imagination. So between 1990 and today, I've drawn on this concept over and again to underscore the protean internal distinctions, internal borders could shape, changing the divisions as it has of inside and out, exclusions and inclusions, and not least their narrow and thick corridors where so many people are positioned on those precarious edges. The next section, an astonishing concept. This moment is not actually the one in which I first drafted this essay. Trump was on the rise. Geert Wilders was about to be eclipsed by an even more popular right-wing populist party in the Netherlands. Marine Le Pen was not yet on the cusp of garnering a new anti-Macron constituency and winning a national election. as she actually may on Sunday. Erdogan was imprisoning more Turkish journalists by the day, and Bolsonaro was preparing to win the 2018 Brazilian elections. I was convinced we should have been more prepared for the rightist racist surge that could no longer be tracked as if on some distant horizon. It was and remains dead center in forging one key political cleavage of our times. These were singular crusaders, all the ones I mentioned, but hardly alone. They operated through racialized distinctions and fears in which a much broader public now shares, even though it was not acknowledged at that time. I was working on the FN at the time, and to which a more vocal racist public demands repressive policies with noxious terms and increased attention. These divisive cuts, I think it's important to point out, these aren't eruptions, BLM, it's not new, but tectonic shifts viscerally felt by some, askewed to others' radars. If prevailing political categories and concepts do not always seem adequate, might it be worth us reshaping and reactivating those dormant with which we could do more? I think of Interior Frontiers as offering a number of possibilities to track the claims and panics raised to fortify inequalities. As a concept, I treat it as both dispositif and diagnostic, identifying the often unarticulated criteria, sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's not, that binds and excludes. As a political concept, affectively charged, it works through multiple sensibilities, and sensibilities are key to my thinking, recruited to harden distinctions between who is us, who is construed as irrevocably them, again, across personhood and polity. In reanimating Interior Frontiers, Johann Fichter's early 19th century concept, EB turned to its contemporary relevance and nuanced qualities. The term, my German is not very good, Grenzen, first appeared in Fichte's 1808 address to the German nation, rendered in French as frontière intérieure. In English, sometimes as interior frontier, but also interior or internal border or boundary as well. What EB called this astonishing concept derives its force, he said, from its condensation of contradictions. The term itself a symptom of those very contradictory qualities. The border is what encloses, imprisons, and puts in touch. It is a site of passage, both an obstacle to movement and the starting point of expansion. I'd further specify those contradictions to include sites of arrest and attenuated movement, managed mobilities of transgression and exchange. Internal borders occupy ambiguous and less visible sorts of space. They may divide the interiority of a territory or empire. I'll go like this when it's EB, okay? Isolate and thus individualize it and serve as an expression of the very constitution of the subject. The final oblique phrasing, it's equally opaque in French and English, is difficult to grasp, in part because it anticipates something not quite there yet, a fundamental feature of internal borders themselves. The clause bears vital weight, I think, pointing still only implicitly at this point to the changing scale on which internal borders constitute subjects and states invested in them. Its politically affective charge seems almost to suspend and secure at the same time the tensions of a political condition in the very multiplicity of its potentialities. Taking analytic advantage of the slippage between what becomes internal, both person and polity, I think is a key to the term's diagnostic capacities and its opening to political effects. Interior frontiers, they're not fixed, it's really important, are malleable, situated and responsive with opaque power. The term itself, EB claims, embodies the word non-representable. I don't really love that word. The limit of every border as seen from within its delineation. So this is not a bird's eye view. It's a multiplex, optic, proximate, and intimate. I see it as a view from those hugging a border's edges and excluded from its protection, as much as, and that's the point, as much as from those seeking security and refuge in its sheltered space. Both elements, interior as modifying adjective, excuse me. I had water, but I don't. Interior as modifying adjective and border as mobile noun gain their force from their polyvalent reference, posing a challenge to make room for these tightening parameters of inclusion it announces, and then the mobile practices to which it refers, exercises that a community individuals have to practice on this step themselves, as well as it being a state project. It can't just be a state project. Adherence and exclusion are conjoined, not sequentially in fixed order, nor necessarily at the same time. Ambiguous sites, milieu, persons, and investments that interior frontiers delineate are inherent features, I would argue, such a political concept affords. It provides a succession of vantage points to identify the making of the stranger, as we'll see this is really important to EB, in the matrix of citizen and subject, and the affective alliances that go with them, blurring these distinctions between political rationalities and an effective economy. So these for me are two important features of it, where belonging and exclusion lodge. An interior frontier makes the personal fundamentally political, fortifying the tenuous attachments that allow a me the sense of being part of a we, an elemental feature in recruiting that me to invest in distinguishing us and them. Interior frontier, I see figuring as a commanding concept, enabling affirmation of political logics that make citizen, stranger, enemy, and foreigner unstable appellations. Security regimes invest in augmenting those fears and distinctions, what they're supposed to say about the loci of descent and internal enemies in the making. It raises concerns also, which I don't have time to talk about here, over purification and a kind of vigilance against contaminations. This immunitas that Robert Esposito talks about. It foregrounds the uncertainty of the distinctions rather than the fixity on which these identities depend. It points to state investments in casting the interior differential of rights to the exterior frontiers that ricochet back to the interior. Again, I think these are all processes for us to follow. Strikingly, already in 1981, more than condemn an endemic racism in the French Communist Party, of which EB was a member until officially expelled on the day after his text appeared, EB called out an endemic racism in France. This is so much earlier than so many people did so, intimately tied to its colonial history and the resurgence of a nostalgia for France for the French. One symptom of what he was to call, and I was really struck by this, a racist syndrome. Interior frontier then does work as a political concept. Its fluctuating parameters mark diffracted histories of the present. It's intangible, occluding a central feature of racialized states as well. As diagnostic, it points to where. So I think of it as really conceptual methodology, which is always the thing that I think about, teach with, and talk about. It points to where and how sites of anxious over-identification emerge. It identifies the conditions that depend on nurturing intimately and fiercely held dispositions that those conditions solicit and on which they call. And as such, it's both corporeal and affective quality of body and mind. How one's body is disposed, where disgust is directed, shaping comportment and distaste, one of the essays in my new book on goût and dégoût, for what is imagined to produce discomfort and dis-ease. How these interior borders are positioned and where one falls vis-a-vis their gated space, marking, as I've insisted, the most consequential and violently guarded racial fault lines in our world today. is clear. For some, ready inclusion is easily conceived. For others, foreigners, those deemed strangers, immigrants, children of immigrants born in France, and whoever, however, dangerous persons are at that particular moment defined, those borders are checkpoints for some, trespassing warnings for others. No official papers are ever enough to guarantee passage, for they are not secured by barbed wire, but by unarticulated and often inaccessible conventions that grant no entry. Those conventions can be boldly advertised with easily decoded terms like family values, serving to police who knows what family is, what kind of families count, what living arrangements are considered abhorrent and beyond any evaluation or value. But paradoxically, and crucially, whether invisible or displayed, the attributes of interior frontiers are made hard to decipher. They may be experienced as amorphous, narrow, petty by those excluded, instilling more than a ressentiment. Rather, a categorical refusal to accept the required compromises demanded by what, in the end, guarantee or even offer assurance of equity or refuge. No, they do not offer, a guarantee or assurance of equity or refuge for all. Fichte developed the term at a moment of national despair to counter the dismal tenor of a defeated German nation on the brink of ruination following the Napoleonic Wars. In winter 1807, addresses to the German nation was a provocation to take up moral arms rather than the militarized, deadly weapons of war. It was to be a unifying, enabling concept in his vision, and by E.B.'s account at the time, a potentially radical one. Well, if in Fichte's hands, it was a fortified moral barricade against erosion of nation itself, one could be just as struck by its underside, which I was. The raw, visceral, passionately protected distinctions it bears potential to activate. I think here of racism's intimate and surreptitious dwellings, bodily, affective, and in the flesh. So briefly, I just need to give you, in quote, Fichte's own words, which are pretty incredible. He says, the first original and truly natural boundaries of states are beyond doubt their interior frontiers. Those who speak the same language are immediately and naturally linked by the very multitude of invisible bonds to one another by nature itself. Prior to any human artifice, they understand each other and are capable of continuously developing this understanding. They belong together and are naturally one, an indivisible whole. Such a whole cannot desire to absorb or mix with another of a different heritage, scent, and language without at least initially confusing themselves and without profoundly disturbing the regular development of their culture. The outer demarcation of one's dwelling only follows as a consequence of this inner border. That's Fichte. Well, italics might not be needed, but when I write this, it's always in italics and in black font. It's so strikingly dissonant with any notion of an inclusive polity, it seems to warrant added attention. German salvation here is sought in a nationalism generated out of the multitude of invisible bonds of peoples constituted not by the borders of the territory they inhabit because they speak the same language. E.B. credits him with two things: with refusing to reckon descent through blood, okay, fine, nor that belonging is not derived from some objectivity of language, but rather how it's lived. Still, I take E.B.'s interpretation to be generous because he takes the future policy possibility it offers to fortify moral responsibility and sees a new history also as a potential. The concept still holds political promise for him with what he calls, E.B., a profound import. But nothing is inherently positive to my mind or inclusive about such attachments. Here, though, E.B. begins to halt before the paradox. Internal borders produce division and unity, he writes, closure and opening then he notes that the new internal borders emerge for Fichte in an educational system that, quote, suppresses the difference between conditions as it creates another critical kind of internal border. Okay, this is where he sets it out as something different. As he hesitates on a more somber note, we might ask too, whether the whole education process doesn't substitute for the historical division of social conditions between the good and the bad, and the méchant, an invisible border between two species of men. That last sentence I find chilling. A utopian unifying project, possibly turning into a racially bifurcated violent one. For those categories of persons deemed disposable, exterminable, dangerous to the defense and society and the security of the state. It's clear where the racial geopolitics would be drawn. Here it portends one powerful Nietzschean installment of unequally valued human and not quite human kinds. Interior borders, but they are unequivocal potentialities that mark restrictive exclusions and new divisions, hierarchies of worth, and privileged moral affiliations. Their contemporary evidence prompting EB's reanimation in two telling contexts. One is colonialism as an integral internal feature of French society. So that doesn't come up actually right away, but it's sort of there. And the French state and citizenship's interior features itself, a property in the double sense as a property being an intimate character of a person and a legal disposition. Now citizens and subjects are distinguished not only legally, but by these interior frontiers whose layout and outline, le trace, are at once mobile and constantly overdetermined. So distinctions between a national and a foreign are implicated in defining where the private begins and the public ends. So it's sort of a whole other conceptual methodology for locating that. Historically, one finds another rethinking. Interior frontier itself is, as I mentioned, a political dispositif, describing new distributions and divisions. So it's the laboring classes replaced by a category of étrangers, immigrants, colonized subjects, making race the divisive wedge. But something else emerges. The connotation of interior draws toward the person to characterize those persons making them up. A new formulation of racism emerges in what he calls, and I think this is really powerful, the psychic structure of the state. Great title for a book. As E.B.'s writing compresses more around racism and sub-citizens, there is less an endorsement, as there was early, of the felicitous possibilities than a dis-ease. As he notes, the radicality of Fichte's address does not protect Fichte against the highly ambiguous political implications of his doctrine. For if racism is understood not as an additive or complement to nationalism, but its product and fundamental infrastructural support, then the concept takes on a whole other balance, one dependent on institutionalized inequalities and discriminations that internally divide not only subject and citizen, but each among and within themselves, not subscribing to the notion that if you're citizens, everything's fine. Double consciousness in such a political frame, as Du Bois called it, may not only be the fate of those who are explicitly raced, a distinct doubled consciousness may be the state of those endorsing racisms while denying their adherence to secure themselves. So that absolutely, ambiguous, hypocritical contradiction. Europeans in the colonies were not unique in practicing what I've called elsewhere a politics of disregard, trafficking between claims to ignorance and practices of ignoring, accentuating the unease that comes with subscribing to the fictive worth of those distinctions. On first reading Fichte and Les Frontières Intérieures of E.B., I was struck by its resonance with colonial vocabularies, evoking what constituted the invisible bonds of white colonial privilege, the moral distinction, the privileged cultural capacities was a term I kept using before I read E.B., that European colonials reserved for themselves. The concept captured in its almost oxymoronic quality, the sort of unspecified moral criteria coming up all the time, used to distinguish which colonial subjects merited European equivalence in a court of law. That merit required a particular kind of familiarity and ease in European surroundings, evinced in child rearing, schooling, domestic management, house plans, house manuals, Dutch proficiency in language, criteria deployed to bar those who did not display and could not adequately demonstrate that they felt chez eux, at home, in a European milieu. As striking was Fichte's very emphasis in describing this intangible belonging as the invisible. It's exactly the same phrase used in Dutch and French colonial documents to assert who could be accorded the privilege of a white European status. These were part of every day. It either could be touched, though unnamed, named, but unseen. The concept seems to reach equivocally for something more than mere affiliation, more an interior landscape of personhood, responsive to as it shapes one's dispositions. The term that Fichte uses is the most private feelings and attachments in the social world. French and Dutch colonial archives seem alert to animating and securing European interior frontiers at every turn. A really strong example that I really want to cut short but give you. Thus, a colonial judge in Saigon could determine that a mixed blood boy, métis, in the 1870s be tried more severely in a native rather than European court of law, despite having a European father, because he did not demonstrate, this is so Fichte, the sort of visible and interior qualities that showed his love of country and moral respectability. He was illiterate in French, demonstrated no distaste for Germans, as he should have, seemed to speak only a few French words with the added slur that his intimate relation with his alleged French father of lowly origins may have been not parental, but of a sexual part. At issue is not the deed, but the kind of person charged. Convergence then between Fichte's aim to fortify these interior frontiers based on the ethical qualities of participating in a speech community and colonial projects designed to secure racialized government is really hard to miss. Both were hardening interior frontiers in the making. The category of Europeans embellished by imperial pursuits, the category of internal enemy emerging out of those frontiers. E.B. describes citizenship, and this is where he starts moving much more to citoyenneté, operating to ensure and then declare certain kinds of people, mostly from former French colonies and protectorates, not assimilable, between the difference between them and real French style and les immigrés, despite that many of the latter had long been legally French. Again, we may ask with him, if citizenship is based on a principle of exclusion, is it not only a right, but a status, neither fixed nor permanent, but present by degrees? Two moves add further ballast to the term, intensifying its relevance as a concept in its own right for contemporary political thought. E.B. elaborating an even more compelling direction, and this is one I'm really taken with. He makes a striking move, invoking the observation of the well-known renegade Lacanian French psychiatrist André Green's, hardly anyone's ever heard of it, understanding of what constitutes a border in the treatment of madness. In a leap of imagination, E.B. draws on Green's treatment of limit cases and borderline patients. Taking on Green's insight about the border and the line, E.B. shepherds it into another context. In Green's rendition, a border is a line of demarcation that is never a line, but I quote, a vast territory where no precise division allows for the separation between what is madness in his case and what is not. And E.B.'s rendering, interior frontier, does away with a state fiction that a border is a line. There are no clearly demarcated or fixed lines to cross, where the other side provides immunity. Immunity itself is unstable, unpredictably located, hard to achieve. An interior frontier depends on a messy set of attributes intrinsic to it, and not always the same place. Again, it bridges and makes a case for plural interior borders of person and polity. Conceptually and concretely, an interior frontier defines the contours of a protective and tenuous threshold more than a line. And it's this threshold I'm really taken with pursuing further and work. Instead, we might think of thick and narrow corridors where uneasy comportments, sensibilities, sensory aversions, dress and speech meet, unarticulated but not ill-defined, where the standards of normalization and defiance are at war, and as it were, on the line. With intangible sensibilities and a measurable measure, interior frontiers are affective zones as well, where feeling experienced as fear, humiliation, threat, longing, or shame is our indexical of political positioning in the making. So one of the essays in the book is called Weaponizing the Senses, which is precisely about how they are infused inequalities. Green writes, one can be a citizen or stateless, but it is difficult to imagine that one is a frontier. In this single stark phrase, he shatters the parameters of the term. Having a frontier, he writes, is not the same as being. How am I doing on time?
Oh, well, you still have time to wrap up, but I also want to remind listeners that if you have questions for Professor Stoller, please put them in Q&A section.
Absolutely. So, I'm 2/3 of the way through. So if you need to stop me at any point, please do. So E.B. attends, asking whether it's just such a contradiction in Green's no man's land, where so many people actually live, that affect up close their very being, inasmuch as they are subject to being, neither in a physical, legal, and psychic space that is neither this nor that. So ni ceci, ni cela. Gerard Altib made a similar observation with respect to the relationship between the rise of the Front National and the racism directed at those designated as the Maghrébins, where he said the later, quote, camped at its doors and constituted its frontier, also forcing the question, is it really only on the margins of society, of the banlieue and the outer quartier, where this frontier is recognized and drawn? Or is it, as E.B. asked, the parties, the nations, the regions that we have habitually come to consider as having borders themselves are ones? What is actually interior internal remains intentionally loose and open problematic, serving as a diagnostic of how persons were shaped. E.B. dresses and skirts how states harness individuals' affective states, though, marshaling distinctions that make up who they imagine themselves to be, need to be to preserve security, what they need to master to know they belong. In returning to the adjective internal and its political potential, more demands are put on the other polysemic features of the internal with a slight shift of political grammar. Interior slides from adjective to an active verb, a set of practices and attachments imposed on and embraced, interiorized by individuals, internalized in citizens and subjects. And with the semantic shift, the internal border is rendered with more substance, equally shaped by and defined through the dispositions and habits of those who relish its delineations. I'm going to skip some so we can maybe get through. So this imagined protective border joins the cultivation of a body politic secured through a cultivation of the self. Such differences are not in the service of flourishing communal well-being. Rather, I would call them circumscribed civility, where participation for some humankinds is categorically foreclosed. Impenetrable, a word that E.B. uses, I think it seals through darker fate. I'd argue that ambiguity serves a political purpose that keeps it sustained. Such a regime of truth has ugly consequences. E.B. identifies these effects now as ultra-subjective forms of violence. He'll call again on Andre Green to identify them more anonymously again, integrally bound up with the fluctuating representations of the enemy, the fetishized other. In this vision, those expulsed are rendered as disposable waste, while the fetishized figure of us is reduced as a fiction of absolute homogeneity. This damaging vision makes more than those diminished by precarity and weakened will alone. Interior frontiers gain their leverage because they're inscribed in some sort of naturalization of domination. Edward Said's political concept, imaginative geography, that both bifurcates what's deemed a threat, in his case, Islam, and serves as a method, as he put it, of controlling what seems to be a threat to some established view of things, is really pertinent here. This geography is moral and material, limiting what I can care about, what invokes my moral disgust, and what and who falls outside the reasonable purview, what I consider reasonable, of my morally founded principles of concern. On the cusp of the 21st century, E.B. comes to see the border in a radically different way, as what he calls at this point, no longer with these, these useful possibilities, but as the wholly non-democratic condition of democratic institutions. And that's one of the edges that really takes up my book. Transported from the exterior to the middle of political space. And it's that middle that really becomes important. And Nikos Poulantzas, he put it that way in 1978, the internal enemy being amplified when and where the frontiers of national space are internalized. And it's his term at the heart of civil space itself, creating an invisible geography, narrowing the spaces one has the right to inhabit, or in which one can feel at home. In the US, racecraft sets out these geopolitics, defining where one is rendered unsafe or is considered unsafe for others. Incarceration follows. One of the other essays in my book, as Loïc Wacquant writes, in the US, race is a civic felony. The analytic traction of attending to internal borders reappears with new force. When EP sets out to mark Europe as itself a borderland with hardening internal borders threatened by the prospect of European citizenship, such that the category of the national, the self, or what it requires to be the same, also becomes split and subject. These are the unassimilated, also increasingly number rendered unassimilatable, as if they all want to be. On the one hand, with the designation of foreigner, the category of forever foreigner assigned to bolster traditional interior frontiers. The lathe of the concept is turned once again to ask whether the marks of belonging are retrieved in the individual, interiorized in them. E.B.'s efforts to identify the vicious features of interior borders stop somewhere short of at least one of Green's observations that struck me as one of the important things Green had to say, where the latter questions the limit of a person, a question hard to consider without thinking the intrusive transgressions that racialized relations inflict on those subsumed by them. Green makes no reference to Fanon, but his conclusions are resonant with Fanon's description of the psychic scars of a racial colonial machine burned into the future of Europe itself and into the permeable membrane of the flesh. Imagining the limit of a person, Green writes, the envelope of the skin immediately comes to mind, he says, but no, He reminds us the skin is discontinuous and porous. The tissue of flesh is interrupted by other tissues full of holes. Il est troué, that acts as gates or better as customs inspectors. He writes, eyes, here I think of the suspicious gaze, ears, the unwelcome music, the irritant noise of the other, nose, to smells rendered repugnant, mouth, anus, genitalia. For Green, two problems persist: the consistency and the structure of the border, and circulation in and out of its gates. There are different sorts of frontiers, he writes. Those without circulation across them are osmotic membranes that permit communication with a selection among that which should be introduced or held exterior in the case of perturbation, and more vigorously rejected if there is need. In the case of danger, the osmotic borders can enlarge to reveal what is inside. But other measures are possible, he writes, such as a rigidification of the line, a sort of sclerosis, or even a jamming up of the frontier. I think those three images are extraordinary, which creates in the place of a fragile demarcation, rather a no man's land. To be a frontier is to identify one as a moving frontier, to which one submits more than one, which is in one's command. Rigidification, sclerosis, the jamming of frontiers anticipate a securitized present, as though in a future conditional tense and a foreboding. To be a borderline implies that a border protects oneself from crossing over or from being crossed over, he writes, from being invaded, and thus becoming a moving border. A disturbing passage on several counts because it revamps the work that making of interior border entails. I'm almost done. It's not work on a border, on a body, but through one. Bodily exposures are part and parcel of the interior frontier as dispositif. And what of this loss of distinction between space and time to submission to the command, compress into a transgression of my body and senses? The present moment is not alone in fortifying these interior frontiers. The inversion of democracy, as Achille Mbembe puts it, is occurring on a new globalized and imperial scale. Our racial emporium both exceeds nation states as it instills ever more expansive and intimate xenophobias. What forms of sociality might produce common refuge, not anxious retraitment? What's left to learn is more, I think, about their vernacular making, in things, feelings, infrastructural arrangements, in visual images, decibel levels, aesthetic conventions, and what is misconstrued as innocuous common sense. The colloquial form of these battles are deceptively straightforward. There is a we who no longer feel comfortable and feel safely at home. Et nous sommes plus chez nous. We're no longer at home on the lips of more than the Front National. We are where we belong and at home. Nous sommes chez nous, the response of a defiant citizenry born in North Africa and in France. Home is invoked, or rather erupts again with pas de gens chez nous. We don't want these refugees, these squatters, these gypsy encampments in our backyards. When the Calais refugee camp was dismantled, but that term is used again and again among a well-mannered populace in small Dutch towns and throughout the US, some variant of go home where you belong is there all the time. Home repeatedly figures for those who spend so much of their lives in passage, pretending to want to pass just to be able to get through a frontier or guarded zone. As E.B. notes, passing and repassing occur at the mercy of expulsions and familial regroupings through what he calls this viscous spatio-temporal zone, disclosing on some distinctive features, closing in the mirror image is dark. It is no surprise then that those frontiers can emerge as such a hollow space. As he puts it, it's almost a home in which to live a life which is waiting to be lived, a non-life. These designations and conclusion and demarcations of what is at home and who can be are colloquially unfamiliar with a history, colonial history through and through. The French military security apparatus in the 1950s that conceived controlling an inferiorized internal population has now imposed their attention on interiorized population, immigrants and French subcitizens. But the figure of the undesirable element, a term over and over again in the colonial archives, as the Dutch called the colonized, an internal enemy hidden in the folds too of French society, has a deep history, as we know. So both French in and out of the colonies. Distinctions made for interior frontiers, stranger and the enemy are dangerously fused. Internal strangers threaten interior borders. So I see these as providing the negative print of what is considered a true citizenry, and take that as true citizenry takes as its defining features. We know less about the ruinous qualities of life than interior frontiers foster, the ultimate pharmacon, curative and corrosive, protective and poisonous, while altered in density, composition, and form. These spaces of refracted ruination are often the opaque infrared corridors on which divisions rely. In an amazing book from the 1930s, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, James Agee described impoverished white tenant farmers in the American South, for whom there was no possibility of a buffered cell. These were persons, he said, who had slendering forms of freedom over the course of their lives. Such slendering degrees of freedom in this current hyper-commodified world of fictive choice produces a negative space of interior frontiers. Sustenance is crudely abbreviated among those who experience the obscene inequalities that provide fewer buffers, or maybe none. Interior frontiers puncture possibilities that by assuring that the strange, the stranger, the unfamiliar, the too familiar are assaults on feeling at home. Safety and security are elusive. It's a space buttressed by a vicious fantasy that freedom comes from stronger barricades, rather than the embrace of the Hegelian mantra, the radical dependency of us all. Thank you so much. Sorry I took so long.
No, thank you, because it's very eloquent, concentrated thinking, and like I see that there's not a lot of questions coming, so and we have actually only a few minutes left, so I will use this privilege to actually pose my question, which was lingering about for like last 20 minutes around, because like you draw the very interesting line on the stranger, the concept of the stranger in the as a juxtaposition of the this internal frontier as a symbol of internal frontier also. And I've been thinking, because like I've been thinking at the same time about Arendt's refugee idea, about refugees, about refugee. This happened like I was a translator of the refugees into Ukrainian and Russian. And it's also it grasped me that's like this is how stranger feels itself in the circumstances of a need. And we also have like the more than 4 million Ukrainian refugees right now in Europe, and this is also like the understanding of the frontiers inside of the EU is coming to the very vivid understanding there. But at the same time, I was thinking about George Zimmel's idea of a stranger, a stranger as a constitution of the community. Because
yes, absolutely.
And I've been thinking like, have you been putting this together? Because like this division on us and them, it's possible only when you have this subject of just juxtaposition. We actually have we had Jason Stanley speaking few weeks ago on fascism, and this us and them analytical category. So I was thinking like how to put this in the perspective of Zimmel and Arendt as a question of constitution of the stranger through the uh, um, through the subject as such subject as a refugee.
Yeah, absolutely. And it to me, it almost doesn't need an answer. It so clearly maps onto precisely that. The entire idea of interior frontiers is that you need this other in order to establish this communauté. The only way you can establish that someone belongs is to make sure someone does not. But that criteria is not fixed. Who is constituted as the stranger has to do with who at that moment is considered strange to various projects, will not work within certain economic, political projects that can. So when we know a refugee before the 70s, look, it was an exalted category, on the left bank. Everybody wanted Russian refugees. Everybody, had restaurants that brought in people who were refugees. Then as soon as it became North African, race figured so crucially in it. But also when jobs were taken away, when it was seen that Eastern Europeans were taking away jobs in Amsterdam, it again became defined as not needed, disposable, strange things started emerging of what they cooked, how they smelled, what they looked like on the subway. These are worked on, they're managed, they're have a malleability. That the reason I love this concept is because it is precisely about what you're saying, right? It's precisely about this necessity. Somebody once said to me in Paris when all the stuff about Algerian, young men raping, Algerian woman. And she said, look, if we didn't have young Algerian men, we'd invent them, right? It's what secures us. It what makes us feel français de souche, the real French, right? And it's almost banal that is the case. But I think what's exciting to think and useful to think and enabling is this movement historically. And in the short-term history, how it changes, not just from 100 years ago, but how it's changing almost by the day, right?
Yeah. Yes. It's also invokes the about the phenon ideas, about the juxtaposition of the
You're breaking up.
dark skin. I'm sorry. This is part. I was saying it's also bringing up the Fanon's idea
right.
of juxtaposition of white and black.
But
yeah,
it's not. But I don't.
Be unfortunately wrapping up. Yeah.
Okay. I think epidermis is not the only part of it.
Yes, absolutely. It's also I think it's also the social construction of the being the other.
And these sort of cultural competencies that you don't have to say, but that already show that you are part of it in a particular kind of way, right? So it's not all verbalized. And I think, the work I've done around Kant and the aesthetic and judgment of taste really goes to that kind of place. Anyway, thank you for having me. It was true honor. And
thank you. It's honor for us, and it's honor for us to having you and listening for your truly deep and eloquent ideas, and really looking forward for your book, and looking forward to meet you in Kiev sometime later.
I hope so.
I would love to.
Yes,
and I'm not sure. Yeah, I think I'm breaking up. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's again the whole train thing. Yeah, it's all. Yeah, and also I wanted to highlight again that the Global Minds for Ukraine is a program by Kiev School of Economics. We are also gathering donations for Ukrainian army, and we already gathered millions of dollars for first aid kits and And for everybody who's listening, go for our website, check the donation button, and please follow us and follow work of Professor Ann Stoller. She's amazing, and we will be happy to welcome all of you after our victory.
And I'd be thrilled to come again if there was any desire.
It will be. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone listening to us, and have a lovely day, and Slava Ukraini.
Bye-bye. See you in New York.